What does it feel like when a civilization dies? We tend to imagine a sudden, catastrophic event, a single day where everything ends. But the reality is far quieter. When the Western Roman Empire finally surrendered on September 4th, 476 AD, there were no raging fires. There were no glorious final stands at the city gates. The end came hundreds of miles away from Rome, here in Ravenna, a quiet palace in northern Italy where the imperial court retreated. A barbarian chieftain named Odoacer walked into that palace and informed the 16-year-old emperor, Romulus Augustulus, that his reign was over. Odoacer didn't even claim the throne for himself. He simply packed up the imperial robes and crown, sent them east to Constantinople, and gave the boy a comfortable pension. There was no longer anything left in the West worth ruling. The centralized authority of the state was so thoroughly depleted that handing over the crown was merely a formality. To understand the magnitude of that quiet surrender, we must look at this map showing the empire at its peak under Emperor Trajan in 117 AD. It covered roughly 5 million square kilometers, stretching from the borders of Mesopotamia all the way to northern Britain. That vast territory was secured by massive physical infrastructure. Stone barriers like Hadrian's Wall projected a sense of absolute permanence, an iron grip that seemed impossible to break from the outside. Yet that grip did break. Figuring out why requires looking past that final day in Ravenna and conducting a strict autopsy of the centuries leading up to it. The state starved itself from the inside out. Long before any foreign army breached the gates, 7 distinct, overlapping pressures dismantled the empire's ability to survive. The first pressure was severe political decay. Between 235 and 284 AD, the institutional stability that defined Roman governance fractured. The state cycled through more than 50 different emperors in 50 years, mostly military commanders murdering their predecessors to seize the throne. That constant civil war drained the treasury, precisely when the economy stopped growing. The Roman economic machine ran on expansion, conquering new lands to acquire slaves, tribute, and raw materials. When the borders stabilized, that influx of new wealth evaporated. Desperate to pay the military, the government progressively reduced the silver content in these coins. They minted more money with less actual value, triggering crippling inflation that destroyed purchasing power and destabilized trade across the provinces. While the economy contracted, the population itself was decimated. The Antonine and Cyprian plagues swept through the empire, killing millions of citizens in successive waves. Those massive death tolls left fewer hands to harvest crops and fewer citizens to tax. The state was forced to extract more revenue from a rapidly shrinking base of agricultural workers. Political assassinations, a debased currency, and widespread disease compounded one another. They left the Roman administration starved of the financial and physical resources needed to govern. This starvation hit the military hardest. The empire had to guard thousands of kilometers of frontier against external threats, a logistical requirement that became impossible to fund with a shrinking tax base. Unable to recruit enough Roman citizens, the state turned to a fifth pressure, outsourcing defense to the foederati. These were armed Germanic groups hired as mercenaries to fill the depleted ranks. These troops were capable fighters, but their loyalty rested entirely with their local commanders and their paychecks. They had no inherent allegiance to the survival of the Roman institution. Simultaneously, the cultural identity of the elite was shifting. The rise of Christianity introduced an entirely new set of values to the Roman world. For centuries, educated Romans were driven by civic duty and the pursuit of military glory. Now, the cultural focus drifted toward personal spiritual salvation and religious community, drawing administrative talent away from state service. The combination was lethal. The empire lost the physical capacity to project its military power at the exact moment its citizens lost the ideological will to prioritize the state over their own souls. The final pressure came from outside the borders, as massive populations of Germanic tribes began crossing into Roman territory. Looking at this map of Eurasian migrations, we can see the root cause. The Huns, sweeping westward out of Central Asia, violently displaced the neighboring Germanic tribes, forcing them to run. These migrating populations did not initially arrive to conquer Rome. They arrived as terrified refugees, desperately seeking safety from a much deadlier enemy at their backs. But the sheer volume of tens of thousands of desperate people crossing the Danube and the Rhine completely overwhelmed an imperial administration that was already crippled by poverty and corruption. Local officials mistreated the refugees, starving them into open rebellion. When the weakened Roman legions finally marched out to restore order, they met armored cavalry charges, shattering the lines and destroying entire armies. The migrating tribes delivered a fatal blow, but only because the internal mechanisms of the Roman state were already too decayed to absorb the shock. Perhaps the most unsettling truth about this long decay is that the people living through it did not know they were witnessing the end. Wealthy aristocrats continued managing their estates. The courts processed lawsuits. The Senate held its meetings among the grand architecture of the capital. Ordinary citizens normalized the decay. They processed the loss of territory and the failing economy as a series of difficult but temporary problems, assuming the next competent emperor would set things right. So when that 16-year-old boy handed over the crown in 476 AD, Roman culture didn't vanish. What died was the centralized political and military machine that had extracted taxes and protected the borders. The daily routines of society continued for decades, comfortably outliving the foundational institutions that had originally built them. The physical infrastructure of a society frequently stands long after the civilization that designed it is gone. The forces that hollowed out the Roman state are not confined to antiquity. Political dysfunction, an unsustainable economic model, military overextension, and the erosion of civic duty are universal metrics of vulnerability. A system rarely fails in a single, loud event. It fails slowly, piece by piece, while everyone inside is waiting for a return to normal. The fall of the Roman Empire is a mirror, reflecting the inescapable physics of how great powers decay.